Okay, so we are recording, and Bill, go ahead and give us some historical context.
Uh, okay, so no, 3 minutes. Okay,
If
so
we
I
had-
feel like this. I feel like this is something I either need to take 30 seconds or 3 hours, but the in between. Um, so here's what I'm kind of thinking. I'm thinking as we're processing this in the moment, that part of it is like as a scholar, I've written a lot about the election of 1920, and so it's just a centennial of that. And there's some ways I can draw parallels to that. It was another realignment election. The Republicans come to power. It was in the wake of, well, actually, still the pandemic was still sort of going on, the 1918 Spanish influenza, and the voters were just, and they'd fighting World War One, and the voters were just ready, as Harding put it, for a return to normalcy. I also think one way to think about the 1920 election that's relevant to this is not so much the particulars, but it took place at a time when a lot of there's just been a lot of change. It's sort of the Industrial Revolution has peaked. That's brought an enormous amount of economic disruption. There'd been a series of financial panics. The last big one had been Bankers' Panic of 1907. So there's still residual impacts of that in the economy. The progressive era, where they had tried to overhaul and make the government better to sort of fit this new age. So, and then just enormous amounts of social change. The country had urbanized. In the 20s, they were in the midst, they were looking forward to their own sort of intense culture wars. So if you think about things like the Scopes monkey trial and debates over the role of women in public space, race was highly contentious. There was a large backlash against immigration. And I guess I would summarize this as saying that in some ways the election and the politics reflected those big underlying pressures, right, that sort of disrupted the political system. And I see kind of a similar thing today. So on one hand, this election just seems like bananas, like just what the heck's going on here. But on the other hand, we've had other times and other places. So 1920, a lot less dramatic, but it's sort of on top of another sort of major shift in American society. The election of 1968, I see echoes of this. I certainly hear echoes of Nixon and George Wallace and this our current politics. The other big thing I'm thinking about here, as I'm realizing I'm in the third minute of my 3 minutes, is I'm stuck on this. I don't know where to go with it, but it just feels like we've got this 18th century system, maybe early 19th century system, and the Electoral College and all that sort of stuff that we can get into more detail if you want. And we're trying to run it. It's like we're trying to run this 21st century society through it, and it just parts of it aren't working. Although I keep telling my students the Electoral College has never worked as intended, in part because it was never clear how it was intended to work. It was literally built by a committee after the Constitutional Convention to figure out the things they couldn't figure out, like it was a committee of afterthoughts. And so I keep thinking about how we've got this Electoral College, and it was built for an agrarian society at the beginning of the 19th century, into the 18th, into the 19th century, and we're here in the 21st century trying to figure out how to make it work in a highly urbanized country connected by the internet. So I will end there. Was I under 3 minutes?
So yeah, that was close enough, Phil. Thanks so much.
Okay.
That'll give us a lot to think about. And so next we'll have Dr. Ibrahim Zavad, who's a professor in the political science department, to maybe give us some comparative context. So Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Okay, hi. So right after, 2 years ago, after we started talking seriously about the new elections, the new presidential elections, all expectations, and I am not referring only to public opinion polls, but to political analysis, all sound political analysis between quotation marks, pointed to a sweeping victory for Biden and the Democrats and a humiliating defeat for President Trump. I have never read anything contrary to that. Now, the question is why? Why do we have those expectations? I would say for two reasons. One is President Trump's character. He is a habitual liar. He is very rude. He's, his character. But more importantly, his policies, his agenda, his platform, his populist, hyper-nationalist, white nationalist, anti-democratic, and racist stances, sometimes implicit racist stances, sometimes very clear and explicit racist stances. And then we had a judgment day. This day, November 3rd, was supposed to be a judgment day, a reckoning day for the Republicans. That, of course, was not the case. There was a judgment. It was a very clear judgment. It turns out that President Trump is an immensely popular president who garnered, according to the latest numbers, close to 70 million votes. I mean, this is historic. My understanding is he would be the second highest votes, got the second highest votes after Biden, if this is true. The elections showed us that the public, the American public, actually endorsed, not of course all of them, but half, metaphorically speaking, half the public endorsed President Trump's agenda, his white nationalism, his racism, his other values, endorse it. Now, there's a question here about what's going on within the Republican Party. So many people claim that President Trump sort of manipulated, hijacked the Republican Party. That is absolutely far from the truth. As a matter of fact, Trumpism is driven by demand, not by supply. I mean, we saw that very clear in the elections, that there is a demand for Trumpism. It's not only about President Trump and his capacity to manipulate his base. But this actually points to a major split in American life, split over moral values, core values. And this is where democracy becomes really in danger. I'm not suggesting that democracy is in imminent danger. It is in danger because democracy does not survive only on the basis of institutions and rules and laws and practices. We have all of that. I think we would be fine. Nothing really major would happen. We would survive that. But I'm talking about really the social basis of democracy, which, to be honest with you, I feel that it's being eroded. The support for certain values, for core values, are being eroded by the day, by the hour. And the Republican Party is really going along with that. And this is a major issue, in my opinion, that democracy cannot survive when half the population does not endorse certain moral values. When you accept certain values that are anti-democratic, sometimes explicitly racist values, then democracy itself becomes in danger.
You're muted, Rose.
Thank you, Ibrahim, and thank you for letting me know that, Ben. Yeah, we'll and actually on the mute thing, I think we're getting a little feedback. So if you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself, that would be helpful. And next, we'll hear from a colleague in political science, Dr. Bart Lambert.
Thank you. I want to build off of what Ibrahim says. We were expecting this blue wave that would repudiate Trumpism, and we did not get it. And instead, what I see is that we are a 50-50 nation, which is extremely polarized. We see that the election, if you look in Arizona, in Nevada, in Wisconsin, in Georgia, these states are being decided by 20,000, 30,000, in some cases 2,000 votes. We are very, very closely divided, but at the same time, people are also very, very polarized. A lot is at stake now, and people know it, and that leads to increasing conflict. We've seen this, for example, with the last 3 appointments to the US Supreme Court, where the vote was, what was it, 54 for Gorsuch, 50 for Kavanaugh, 52 for Amy Coney Barrett. very, very close. It used to be the Supreme Court would be decided by 90, 95 votes, but we don't see that. We also see that going on in the House of Representatives. The Democrats thought that they would expand their majority. They would expand it by 10, 15 or more votes, but they lost. They lost 5 votes. So it's been a narrowing there. And then also we see this in the Senate. The Democrats were dreaming of this this home run with also getting the Senate, winning the Senate. They did not win the Senate. There's still a chance to pick up 2 seats. I think it is highly unlikely. So we are going to remain a divided country where there are very, very high stakes. What is going to happen? Will Mitch McConnell continue to obstruct? Will we see a continuation of filibusters? Biden, on the other hand, he has some experience in the Senate. He is a less polarizing figure than Trump. Maybe occasionally he will be able to peel off one of the Republicans in order to maybe get a few things through. But I see that maybe the best thing that Biden can do is to try to reunify the country, forget about pushing forward on any kind of bold Green New Deal or anything like that, just to try to reunify this country. I'm very afraid of the growing conflict in this country. What if those who support Trump refuse to accept the loss? We've already heard about militia groups going into the Capitol building of Michigan, in Lansing, Michigan, carrying AR-15s and talk about kidnapping the governor and holding some kangaroo court and then executing her. Now, how much of this was just loose talk? I don't know, but the Proud Boys and their AR-15s have shown up in Phoenix as well. I talked to some of my students who are supporters of this, and I hear their reasoning. I don't know. They just sound like they're coming from another planet, the information that they're receiving. So I am worried that we're so divided and so polarized now, and what this means for the stability of our political system. You're muted, Mary Rose.
Thanks, Bart. This is a very dire time I think we're in. I don't know. We're going to hear next about some of the social context for this from Dr. Ben Gross, who's a professor in the sociology department. And I don't know, Ben, if you can give us any more positive spin on this.
Nah, positive might not be the correct word. I don't know. But what I wanted to point out is that when talking about social context, is that for most Americans, media is really where they understand and discuss politics, right? We live in a highly mediated society. It's been estimated that people spend as much as 5 to 6 hours per day with mass media devices. And that's not even including social media devices and checking the internet and so on. And so much of American life is highly mediated, and that's where many people get their political news and have their political discourse. And in the United States, particularly over the last 30 or so years, you've seen a privatization of news organizations in the United States. And news organizations have learned that the way to best maximize profit is to develop news formats which emphasize conflict. And that sociologist David Alteid talked about how television in particular is a perfect format for conflict between groups of people. And so we have a generation of people who have been socialized into having these sort of winner-take-all debates with one another. You know, I'm right, you're wrong. Let's never compromise. Let's mock each other. Let's question each other's claims. And that's become a sort of a normative practice. So we have this sort of media format that's really structuring a public discourse of distrust, frustration, and trying to defeat the other side rather than get to compromise or even factual agreements. Now, The other thing that I wanted to add on to this is that we're also in a current situation where we have a president who, as Dr. Zabad pointed out, has developed very strong identity ties within the group, right? That many Republicans are very much in support of Donald Trump. I believe the most recent public opinion polling showed about 91% support among Republicans. So you have a candidate who, one, has made very strong in-group identity with his party. Second, you have a person who is highly experienced with the media ecosphere. This is a person that has had a reality television show, has practically lived in front of the cameras for about 3 decades, understands how to get messages across, particularly in mass media. And third, he uses a rhetorical style which really takes advantage of people's distrust of other institutions, right? You can find Donald Trump constantly talking about, you shouldn't trust the news media because they're biased, or you shouldn't trust political politicians because they're crooked, and you can't really trust even medical experts because they don't really know and they have their own agendas. So you have this person who's using these rhetorical devices, which has defined himself and among his followers as really the only source of truth. And this is why you see public opinion support for Donald Trump pretty much flatlining at about 40%, regardless of the claims that he's made. He's defined himself among his followers as being really the only source of truth and being the only person who will not BS people and will speak frankly on issues. And so we have this sort of very highly conflicted media ecosphere where people have kind of socialized into not liking one another, kind of socialized into wanting to have conflicts and thinking of conflicts as being sort of the normative standard, trying to defeat one another. And at the same time, their own emotions have been heightened by this constant media ecosphere. And you have a president who's really defined truth as being what he claims, and really taking advantage of the distrust that people have in their social institutions for political gain.
Right, thanks, Ben. And with that context, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rich Lee from our Giandoli School of Communication, who also has a long history in journalism and covering politics. And I think we're seeing a lot of dilemmas in terms of how, given the dynamics, right, that Ben has discussed with the president sowing distrust and oftentimes lying. How does the media handle this? So I will hand it over to Rich to round out the panel.
Okay, thanks, Mary Rose. I'm actually going to throw out a few positive things. You might not agree with me, but at least I'll throw them out there. And let me start by saying journalism is covering the unexpected. That's what journalists do, because what's expected generally isn't news. But what's happened over the last couple of days, even though we didn't know what the results were going to be, they expected that we weren't going to know who won the election on election night. And I'm teaching an honors class on elections this fall, and I've been speaking with a lot of reporters, people involved with campaigns, and they did a lot of work preparing for this week. So it wasn't like they hit it came out of the blue. And I think it showed. To me, what I've seen from the time the polls closed through today, and we'll probably continue to see, is journalism doing what it really should do. I tell my students, your job is to tell your readers or your viewers things they can't get themselves. A basketball game, anyone can watch it, get the score, you know what the big plays are, but you're the only ones who can talk to the coach and the players afterwards and get that. And I think that's what we're seeing from the media. They have reporters in every key state. They're taking you inside the rooms where the votes have been counted. The anchors are putting some perspective, actually like civics lessons, and not just the electoral college, but how the votes are being counted, the different types of votes. So I think from that standpoint, things are working well. You're right, there are a number of dilemmas. Before I get to last night, there's a dilemma about when you call a state for a candidate. And we've seen, some news organizations calling Arizona early, others, I believe, still haven't called it. And they all have different methodologies that they use. I can tell you that they differ, but they're very sophisticated. Nobody just haphazardly calls a state. And some of that is a result of the 2000 election, when all the networks were pretty much relying on the same source of material. So they all got it wrong more than once. So That's one of the dilemmas. That the question at hand, which I think spurred this whole conversation, was the president's remarks last night and how you cover them, and when you know he's saying things that are just blatant, outright lies. And on one hand, he's the president of the United States. You have to report what he says. You can't just ignore him. Although there were networks that turned away from his press conference. But if you're the president, what you say is news. I think the media has a responsibility to be more than just a mirror, not just to report what he says. Our job is to shine a light on not just what he says, but on anything. So if he says something that's untrue, the media has to say that that's untrue, and they're doing that. But I think what they can do a better job at is not just saying, these 3 or 4 things are not true, but showing why they're untrue. There's fact checkers out there. That takes a little time, but it's so hard. Even when people are confronted with facts today, they don't believe things. But I think if they did a better job of when there are some untruths coming out of the president's mouth, showing exactly, what the facts are right away, which is difficult, but that's the world we live in today. It's a 24/7 world, and you have to get used to it. I also would just say that we as consumers of news have some responsibility too, to check things out, not just to look at headlines and tweets, to make sure we're reading stuff from legitimate sources. And I think everyone on this session probably does that, but unfortunately, the rest of the country does not.
All right, thanks, Rich. That is a great place, I think, to turn things over to a larger discussion. And I said, it looks like it's mostly our colleagues, the faculty and staff here, but oh, no. Steve?
Yes, okay. I'm not a professor. I'm an alumni, and just tuning in at Rich's and Ann's invitation. So I have no.
Great. Well, welcome.
No. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and I think we had one. I saw one lib student had been on here earlier. Is that student still on? I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I think it's mostly faculty and staff, which is great. This conversation is being recorded, so maybe some students will tune in, because I wanted to give first chance to any students out there to ask questions or give comments, but I'm not seeing any. So not seeing any. We'll open it up. I'm kind of.
I break the ice.
All right. I'll break the ice too.
Okay, you go ahead.
Break the ice. All right. No, you go, please.
Well, I wanted to direct a question at Rich Lee. That has to do with how wrong the polls have been. Again, the polls were reporting upwards of, they were reporting this blue wave, and they were reporting that Biden would win by 5 to 8 percentage points in various places, and it really didn't turn out that way. And we're still in this limbo of not knowing. And why is it that the polls got it wrong again? I thought they fixed these problems. So I don't know if anyone want to chime in. Rich, maybe you have something to add to this. And you're muted. Rich, you're muted.
Oh, Rich, you're still, let me see if I can unmute him.
Sorry about that. I was going to say, I suspect the pollsters are going to say something similar to what they said in 2016, that they did not get it wrong, that, what they were reporting, the polls were within the margin of error, and, that the press did not fully report what the polls said. They reported who was winning, and, that the detail of the margin of error, explaining the margin of error to the public, wasn't in there.
I'd like to chime in on that. There's a possibility that that one of the weird things that we're seeing is that people, the actual thing that a pollster needs to ask a question to get a response to in order to report something, people are not answering polls like they once did. They're being reluctant or about answering questions. They're not answering questions, or they're not responding truthfully. So is it that the pollsters are wrong, or did they just simply report the information that they had, and that information doesn't turn out to be quite what they expected?
Pollsters describe that as response bias. And they speculate that there's a response bias away from Trump supporters, that a Trump supporter gets a telephone call. Hi, I'm from the New York Times. Do you want to take an opinion poll on the election?
Yep.
And the Trump voter does not.
I
So
agree with them.
that's been one suggestion. If you look at how they do opinion polls now, there's a lot of tweaking they do of their sample. The response rate on the telephone now is only about 10%, and so they'll go in and they'll take the sample and they'll weight it to make sure that the number of women and Republicans and young people and African Americans are consistent with the community survey that the U.S. Census does, but they're missing something. There's something that they're missing.
If I can say something, I agree with you, but really, many people support Donald Trump, but they perfectly understand his character and they feel embarrassed. Even if they're talking to like an anonymous person or somebody they don't know, or even if it's online, they still don't feel comfortable saying that, okay, I support this president who lies basically every time he breathes. They don't, but they do support him. And so they actually give the wrong answer. And the other point is, I strongly agree with you that actually many of Trump's supporters do not respond to the polls. He has been sort of disseminating, misinformation about the media. The media is the enemy of the people. That includes, pollsters, and they just stay away from that. So the sample is not representative. I think they can't keep getting it wrong for like 8 years now. 2016, 2018. Something is deeply, deeply flawed in the whole system of polling.
Yeah, I was going to say, I also have the impression that with the polling, they focus a lot on national polls, although I think you try to get away from it. And when we got 50 state polls, and I'm not sure what the quality is of the state polling, as we focus on, we get focusing in on what's going on nationally with the popular vote.
Yeah, I think it varies from state to state, but that was one of the changes I think we saw between 2016 and 2020. There was so much focus on the national polls in 2016, and at least there was more reporting in 2020 on, the state polls, and because people knew, that the popular vote really didn't matter. It was the electoral vote.
I do have a question for a couple of the professors, if I could. First, for Professor Payne, I appreciated your historical context. I'm a history student myself, so I appreciated it, and I fully agree with you. And I also was interested in your talk about the Electoral College as to whether or not it is functional today, whether or not it can function. But I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about the way we vote today? One of the things that has come up with this particular election is that so many people wanted to vote early. In other words, give the consumer a choice when they can vote. When you don't limit people as to when they can buy something or get something, when Black Friday is the entire month of November now. And what we've done is we've given the consumer a lot of choice. So is the way that we vote, is that need to be changed? In other words, go to more electronic voting or remote voting, those kinds of things. How do you feel about that? And that's directed to Professor Payne.
Yeah, I think that the way we vote's definitely going to change, and I would be shocked to see in a post-pandemic world if we went back, if we we went back to a single day to vote, and I think a lot of people are going to stick with mail-in voting. I at this moment in time, I'm a little leery of voting electronically, although I suspect at some point it will happen. The technology will be there. And and again, I'm getting way outside of my area that I can speak competently about, but at some point I imagine there's going to be something to do with blockchain or something like that where we could vote electronically and have security. But at this moment in time, I don't think we're there. But the sort of how we vote does change. Like we sort of act like this is something that we set it in stone, and it's just not the case. Like we used to be, we voted in public. And then we went with the Australian rules, the secret ballot. Well, at one point in time, you walked into a place and you declared your vote. You stood up in front of everybody and said, "This is how I want to vote." So, so I guess that's my way of saying that. Yeah, I think we're probably are going to end up having to change. We are changing how we vote because we're an increasingly urban society. We're increasingly a society where Tuesday's an awkward day to vote for a lot of people. A week makes a lot of sense. And I think I wouldn't be shocked going forward if we don't see some discussion, which would be very hard to implement, of how to have more uniform voting across the country. Because I think voting and access to voting is going to be a big political issue and has been and will continue to be for a while. Because one of the things you see historically is this sort of, the way you kind of put it more rhetorically is like when we say we the people, who gets to be included in the we, and then voting is this historic mark of citizenship.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know if any of my political science colleagues wants to jump in on that one. I see Dr. Tillman is also here on either the voting, right, election season now, or maybe the electoral college, right? Question, because there's in some circles there is a movement to say maybe that's something. I mean, we didn't used to directly elect senators, and that got changed. So I don't know if any of my political science colleagues wants to jump in.
Well, I'll jump in. There's a proposed reform of the Electoral College where states would agree to apply their Electoral College votes to the winner of the popular vote nationwide. And once, I believe New York has signed on to this, a number of other states have signed on to it. I believe at this point there are enough states to account for 190 Electoral College votes. And once there are enough to account for at least 270, then it will go into effect, which would be a way, the problem with trying to get rid of the Electoral College is that it would take an amendment, which is a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate, and then 3/4 of the states have to agree to it. Well, the way the Electoral College is set up, with every state getting at least 3 votes, it's not exactly proportional, as you know, and it's a small state bias. And there are 14 states that have 5 or fewer Electoral College votes who would probably see that their influence would diminish in the presidential election process. So this would be a way of getting around that. It does not require an amendment. It just requires the state legislatures to agree to this. The question is whether that would, whether that's constitutional, because I guess there's some obscure law that says that states cannot form compacts to get around the Constitution. And would the Supreme Court consider it that way?
Thanks, Bart. That's interesting. Does anybody else any?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it
Could
seems
I-
to me like we talk a lot about reforming the Electoral College every 4 years, and then it kind of takes a back seat until the next presidential election. And there's efforts, like the one that Bart referenced, I'm familiar with, and they've been trying for a while to get enough states to make that work.
So any other questions for our panelists or observations, comments?
Mary Rose, could I ask change the subject a little bit?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Alex.
So Ibrahim, you mentioned that, and I agree with this, that there are certain set of core values that are required to keep a democracy going. And as a philosopher, I'm like wondering what you're supposed to do in a particular democracy where half of the people seem to just completely disagree about what our bedrock moral principles to which we're supposed to be committed are as a nation. So Bart mentioned this too. I mean, he mentioned some of his students last week who were voicing support for, or maybe not outright supporting the Proud Boys, but it said something that was sympathetic to them, and he was wondering what planet they're from. And I'm sort of wondering something similar. Like I was teaching animal ethics in my ethics course this last week, and I'm trying to get students to be more sympathetic to this idea about being compassionate towards animals. While we have, 50% nearly of the country voting for somebody, and part of their rallying cry is like, making liberals cry again. Like a very strange thing to me. So there's this question about how we're supposed to, remain committed to these core values when there's a deep conflict between the country 50-50 about what the bedrock moral principles are we're supposed to be committed to in the first place. Like this North Carolina senator that was newly elected that caught some heat for retweeting at somebody saying cry more lib. Like there's this weird lack of compassion going on that is outright rejected. So how are we supposed to collaborate with folks like that?
So Ibrahim, you're muted.
Okay. To be honest with you, I really have no solid answer to that. In those situations, really, change comes from below and from above. We have many social trends nowadays. Technology, social media. Our lives are changing definitely, and this, of course, caused lots of disenchantment and disillusionment, and reinforced this polarization over core values. Now, this is sort of from something we can't really do a lot about, but we also could do something by counting on the leadership. But what do we have here? I mean, the leadership could definitely change something when somebody like a President Trump tells a lie or says that the election, he went on TV and on election night, 2 a.m, saying that while he was winning, he said that the election is being stolen from me. And we never heard a single Republican, the leadership. Where is the leadership? I mean, what happened to all of them? The senators, the congressmen, the opinion, leaders, where are they? We never heard anything of them. That is, they went along with Donald Trump. In this case, really, I see no good pathway to change the leadership, the elites that is in the United States, especially on the Republican side. They are completely absent, and that makes it really a very hard situation. I don't really have an answer to that. The elites are not going to intervene to make sure that we hold on to those values that make us what we are. Then maybe we are in some grave danger, not imminent. This isn't going to happen tomorrow, but look at the trajectory. I'm moving from the Tea Party to the Orange Party to maybe Blood Orange Party in the future. I don't know. I mean, somebody has to intervene and make some corrections. I don't see that happening.
Yeah,
add to that?
I was gonna say I don't have a solution, but I'll admit my profession is part of the problem. As Ben said, we focus on confrontation. That's what's news, but it's also what people want to see. Just to give it some context, if you go back to the start of cable television, when all of a sudden there weren't just 3 networks to watch, and we started to have a world where you could only watch, if you only wanted to watch television with analysts agreed with you, you could do. And then the internet came away, and it got even more so. So that's kind of the world we're in. Like I said, I don't have the solution, but that's a big part of the problem is that people, you can go through your life and spend it all watching television, going on websites that just reinforce what you believe.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I wanted to say that as well. I tend to think about current political conflict today not necessarily being about issues, but about identity. And we currently have a political context in which we have a very much an us versus them mentality, right? And so what social psychologists have told us, and they've explained through what's called social identity theory, is that groups, when they're in heavy levels of conflict, they tend to stereotype one another and dehumanize one another in ways that bolster their in-group and radicalize and vilify out-groups. And so what they've suggested in the social psychological theory, the social identity theory, is that to undo these type of events, you have to have two groups that start to collaborate together, work towards solving mutual problems, and to have increased amounts of interaction to help break down some of the group stereotypes and that have developed. So, I think that if we were going to address this over the long term, I think first would probably be the open admission that we have a problem, but also trying to get people to like what Julie was saying here, we need to venture out of our sort of comfortable cubby holes and try to understand the other side a little bit better. And hopefully Biden, as he takes office, will work towards things that everybody can agree upon that need to be done. And I know those are all difficult to say. It's very difficult to say exactly how that's going to be done. But I think there's some type of combination, at least at the start, would address reducing the toxicity that we currently have.
If I
Yeah.
may,
Oh, I'm
may add
sorry.
something, this might be true, like what Ben said, but you need to have two groups, right, to communicate with one another and to lay the groundwork for sort of conversation and dialogue and compromise and reconciliation. But Ben, you see, the problem is you are equating the two groups together here. I mean, I hear lots of voices from the sort of liberals, progressives, the leftists, the Democrats, calling for reconciliation, compromise. I don't hear that on the other part. The two groups are not exactly equal. There is one group that is pushing for extremism, and radicalism, and endorsed an agenda that is very anti-democratic. I mean, think of what's happening now. I mean, you have a president who literally called to stop counting the votes. And, we heard, I think, what Romney today making a statement. But other than that, the Republican Party is, going along with that. And I don't see this happening. The two groups are not exactly equal, and one is pushing in one direction, the other in the other direction. I don't see the middle ground. That is the problem,
Yeah, I've been reading Jonathan Haidt's old book, The Righteous Mind. He's a moral psychologist that's trying to offer some solutions about how opposed groups in religious and political contexts can work together. But the closer to the end of the book that I get, it just doesn't seem like any of his proposed solutions seem likely to work when you have the sort of diametric opposition that we are dealing with right now, when it really just seems to boil down to a fundamental disagreement about which moral principles the two parties are committed to.
Yeah.
So I'm equally lost.
So
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Professor.
I was wondering if Phil might have any perspective, because I mean, I think my sense is probably we've been in situations in the past that have been equally polarized, but I wonder with the media environment, right? Like,
the 1850s come to mind. So I guess I was thinking about a couple things, like because I have been in my classes talking about other situations where things have been deeply polarized. So one would be the rise of Jacksonian and Andrew Jackson and the splintering of the political party. So I think pretty clearly we're in a period of political realignment, and people feared Andrew Jackson as a dictator. Like a lot of the discussion was the same, and you're going to see again in the 1850s. And so this is actually the really worrying one, is they never figured out how to do this, and it just resulted in civil war. Like Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency, and a significant portion of the country says we just won't accept that result, and that's the Civil War. So I think you see again in the 1890s another period of intense polarization. I mean, they kind of tend to get on the other side in realignment, right? But I guess that's not a guaranteed thing, and it's a painful thing. And sometimes that realignment comes at a heavy cost. Like one of the ways you see the realignment and moving past the sort of intense politics and populism in the 1890s is an agreement around Jim Crow. Like there's an agreement that will just basically be a white political system and will exclude other people. So it doesn't always end well, as I guess is what I'm saying. I also think I've been reading a lot of Jill Lepore stuff because she's very tuned into this. And one of the things she's calling for is like a revisiting of national history, because we've gotten away from both in the academy and just general telling what is basically the story of the United States. And actually one way to understand what we're now is we have our moral principles, we have two deeply different conflicting versions of what the American historical story is. So like one is, if you want to put it in simplistic terms, Donald Trump's 1776 project, which is a celebration of sort of great Americans in the past, and the other one would be the 1619 project. And what Jill Lepore is essentially trying to do is create a historical narrative that brings together an idea that there is an America and there is one story, but one that doesn't just exclude large groups like the 1796 project does, but one that also finds some positive things in the story, that it's not all bad or all good.
I'd like to offer an observation here and see how you all respond to it. You're in an academic world and I'm outside of it, so my perspective is going to be a little bit different on things, but I take a far more optimistic view about our democracy than perhaps what I'm hearing, because the proof in the pudding, the proof is in the pudding that 4 years ago, something happened that scared the ever-living daylights out of a lot of us. And through 4 years, we suffered through this presidency and we hoped that it would end. And now, 4 years later, our democracy has allowed the opposition to elect someone other than that person. So the democracy worked. Our democracy worked. And as far as the idea of people being dissatisfied, 4 years ago, the Democrats were highly dissatisfied, pledging not to work with this new president and work, they were going to do everything. They were going to be the obstacle to try to force change. Now, the Republicans they're going to fall into that role and they're going to have to force change as well. So what I'm seeing from the outside is that our democracy worked. And to offer a little more proof of that, something that Professor Lambert brought up, the idea that, yes, there are 6 or 8 very close states where less than 0.5% separates the two candidates. But in 40 or 42 states, won by each candidate, the percentages are 60-40. 60 for Trump or 60 for Biden, 40 for Trump or 40 for Biden. So, we have this idea that the people in this country spoke. 140 million or more spoke. They did not get suppressed. They were not suppressed. They spoke and they delivered the voice of democracy. And I feel very good about our democracy today. So I'll end there. Thank you.
That's okay.
All right, you might want to mute. And so we're running, we have about 5 more minutes left. So I want to know if there's anybody who hasn't had a chance yet to ask a question or make an observation who would like to jump in. No one? All right, Tracy, you're muted, so unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. I have been watching the returns come in all day today and waiting for them to make comments or decide these last 4 states for whoever they're going to decide them for. It looks like they're going to go for Biden, which is a relief to me. But one of the things that when I was listening to everyone when they were talking about, it seemed that the Republican leadership was not weighing in. I did notice that earlier today, after President Trump had made his 2 o'clock in the morning, I've won, we can stop counting vote down nonsense, that there were a number of Republican leaders that had come up and said, no, that's not the way this works. Mitch McConnell was one of them, though he did not come out and call out President Trump by name, but alluded to that. And I'm just wondering for those of you on the panel, if I'm kind of seeing this as there's a lot of Republicans maybe not saying anything because they're sort of starting to pull away from Trump, seeing that he is being defeated. They're going to have to work with former Vice President Biden, soon to be President-elect Biden. And maybe this is one of those things where it's not the rats are jumping ship, but it's like they're kind of pulling away from him in an effort to keep their jobs when they come up for re-election here pretty soon. Because maybe that it's not that their silence is supporting Trump as much as their silence is not putting them in the spotlight as being supportive of Trump in order for them to stay in their positions. What do you think about that?
I don't know, my colleagues in political science or anybody else on the panel want to?
Yeah, I can sort of say a few words about that. I mean, yeah, we do hear some voices here and there, but they're very dispersed. And you actually are right in that they're afraid to confront Donald Trump. But that is exactly the point, as I mentioned before, that Trumpism is not driven by supply only, but by demand. I mean, the fact that those Republican leaders, entrenched leaders, senators who have been in the Senate for like so many rounds, and they are very well known, they're very popular, they have their places in history, so to speak, like Mitch McConnell, and they don't have the guts to confront Donald Trump. That should tell you a lot about where this country is going. And that's the point which I try to explain is we have differences over core values. It's not only differences over policies, and that those differences are not driven by the manipulation of some elites. I mean, they are deep in society, They do reflect some popular sentiments. And we just saw that in the elections. The Republicans, they are holding on to the Senate majority. They won a couple of seats in the House. I mean, Donald Trump got like close to 70 million votes. I mean, what to do with that? So I don't see the Republican Party sort of moving away from Donald Trump. And one more thing, he is a very popular president and he is not leaving. He is not going anywhere. I don't think he is the kind of person who, once defeated, he's going to leave the White House and then the Republican Party would go back to its old days, social conservatism. I don't think so at all, actually. I think he's going to stay.
I agree. I think he's going to start his own media network, and we haven't seen the end of him.
No.
Besides that, he's pointed the way for others. I mean,
Absolutely.
He was very successful at what he did, and he is teaching others this is the way to power. And this shows that there are people out there, as you say, there is demand for this. There are people out there that have supported him. So Trumpism, it isn't just Donald Trump. It's a movement, really. It's
a movement. And if you look at the trajectory of the Republican Party, I mean, it's not really moving away from extremism. It's actually going, it's escalating, it's escalating, which is really not like it's pointing the way to future leaders who will emulate what Donald Trump did, maybe even worse, maybe worse, and hopefully not, but, Well, guys, I think that's maybe.
Yeah. So Ben, you want to take us out? Last observation.
So yeah, I would say with that with political identity, I would agree with Ibrahim here and Bart. I was going to say political identity seems very, very much driving the politics right now, more than issues, more than anything else. There's this sort of in-group identity in which people have really committed to, and the out-group has really been villainized. And I suspect, getting back to earlier questions, I suspect that how do we get out of that? As both of you said, that this is demand driven, right? They give it to the audience because it's what the audience wants. And I think that our way out of that is to reduce the demand, to use economics terms. Somehow I suspect that the answer to these political conflicts and divides lie outside of politics and getting to see each other again as fully as human beings that we value and respect. And I don't think that we do that on either side right now. I don't think that, I think many liberals personally dislike Republicans and vice versa. And I suspect that the way to get them to reduce that demand and this successful formula that you all were talking about is trying to step away from the politics and trying to remember that what we're talking about is our friends and our neighbors and our people in our community. They're not, some nameless, faceless threat to our in group. And I think that's probably where the solution begins.
Thanks, Ben. That's a great way to round things out, and sounds like a pretty Franciscan perspective. So maybe we'll have to have a follow up with some of the friars who unfortunately were not able to join us tonight. But thanks so much to the panelists and for everybody
Thank you, Mary.
who joined
Thank
us.
you, Mary Rose.
And we will at some point make this recording available to the community because I know some folks had wanted their students to be able to watch it, and I'm a little disappointed that we didn't get student participation.